I slid the tackle box under my arm and stepped off the dock, not rushing, not arguing, just letting the moment stretch while the officer watched me like he expected a scene, but I gave him nothing, and that seemed to bother Brenda more than anything because her smile started to tighten around the edges like she was losing control of something she did not understand, and I could hear the soft hum from the pump house again, steady, mechanical, dependable, the same sound I had worked on 3 summers ago when their irrigation system kept tripping breakers every time the lawn schedule kicked on at sunrise, and back then Brenda had stood in the same spot asking me to fix it faster because her grass was turning brown in front of the clubhouse, and now she was telling me I did not belong anywhere near the water feeding that same system, which told me exactly how little she actually knew about what she was standing on. And the officer cleared his throat and said the citation would be filed if I did not comply, and I nodded once, calm, letting him believe he had control over the situation while I watched Brenda tuck her clipboard under her arm like she had just won something, and behind her one of the sprinklers sputtered for a second before catching pressure again, a tiny hiccup most people would miss, but I did not miss it, not after rewiring that pump relay myself, and it made me look past her toward the service path that ran along the lake's edge where the utility box sat half hidden behind trimmed hedges, painted green to disappear, and I remembered the key panel inside, the labels I had written in black marker, main intake, secondary line, emergency cutoff, all still under my handwriting because no one from the HOA had ever bothered to replace it, and that was the second mistake, not updating the system, not checking who actually maintained the infrastructure they were claiming to own, and as I walked toward my truck I could feel eyes on my back, the neighbors, the camera phone, Brenda waiting for me to react, but I kept moving, gravel crunching under my boots, lake water lapping softly against the shore like nothing had changed, even though everything had, and when I opened the truck door the old hinge creaked louder than usual, echoing across the quiet morning, and I set the tackle box on the passenger seat and paused just long enough to look back at the lake one more time, at the clean edges, the still surface, the perfect reflection of houses that depended on that water staying exactly where it was, and for the first time I noticed the maintenance gate near the marina was slightly ajar. Just a few inches, enough to show the edge of the control panel inside, and I knew that gate was not supposed to be open unless someone had been inside recently, and I had not gotten a service call, which meant someone else had been messing with a system they did not understand, and that changed the whole situation from a simple fine into something bigger, something structural, because if they were already touching the controls without knowing the load balance or the timing sequence, they were risking more than just a fishing argument, they were risking the entire water cycle that kept this neighborhood looking the way it did, and as I climbed into the driver's seat I could still hear the pump humming, steady for now, but not as stable as it should have been, not with that gate open, and not with Brenda pretending she owned something tied into a system she could not even identify, and that was when I realized this was no longer about a lake or a fine, it was about who actually controlled what kept this place alive, and the moment that system slipped, everything built around it would start to show cracks, and Brenda had just put herself right in the middle of it, and I closed the truck door slowly, listening to that hum fade under the engine turning over, knowing I was going to check that control panel whether she liked it or not, because something inside that system was already off. I turned the truck around before I even hit the main road and parked it 2 houses down where the hedges blocked the view of the marina gate, then I cut the engine and sat there for a second listening, because that pump hum was still in my head and something about it did not line up with what I heard on the dock, not as steady, not as balanced, and when a system like that drifts even a little it means someone changed something they should not have touched, and that thought was enough to get me moving again, boots hitting pavement, air warming up as the sun climbed higher, the neighborhood waking up around me like nothing had shifted, like the same water was not about to become a problem for every single house lining that shoreline. And as I stepped onto the service path the gravel felt looser than usual, disturbed. Recently, small detail but it mattered, because nobody walks back here unless they have a reason, and when I reached the maintenance gate I saw it clearer now, the latch not fully set, a thin gap wide enough to slip fingers through, and that was wrong, that gate stays locked tight unless I or the county utility opens it, and I had not been called, so I pulled it open slow, hinges giving a low creak that sounded louder than it should in the quiet morning, and inside the panel box the smell hit me first, warm plastic, faint ozone, the kind of scent you only get when a system has been opened and powered without knowing the load, and I stepped closer, eyes scanning the switches, the relays, the wiring I had labeled myself years ago, and right there on the secondary intake line someone had flipped the override toggle, not fully, just enough to bypass the automatic cycle and force manual pressure during peak irrigation hours, which explained the sprinkler hiccup I heard earlier, and it also explained something worse, because that override pulls directly from the lake intake without regulating draw, which means if it stays engaged too long it stresses the pump and drains faster than the system can balance, and that is not a short-term issue, that is the kind of mistake that spreads, lawn by lawn, pressure drop by pressure drop, until people start noticing their grass drying out and their fountains losing flow. And I crouched down to check the control log, the small digital display still active, and the timestamp told me the override had been engaged just before sunrise, right when Brenda likes her perfect green lawns to look their best, and that made me exhale slow because it fit too clean. She wanted control, she forced the system, and she did not even know what she had actually done, and then I saw the tag clipped to the inside panel, a temporary HOA maintenance note, handwriting I did not recognize, probably one of her hired contractors trying to impress her without understanding the system, and that was the third mistake. Letting someone unqualified touch a live control network tied to every property around this lake, and I stood up, looking out through the open gate at the calm water, surface still perfect, no sign of the strain building underneath, and that is always how it starts, quiet on top, pressure underneath, and the worst part is nobody notices until the effects reach their front yard, and I reached for the override switch but stopped just short, fingers hovering, because if I reset it now they would never realize what they had done. They would just keep pushing boundaries, keep claiming control over something they did not understand, and I needed them to feel it, not all at once, not destructive, just enough to make the system respond to their interference, and I stepped back, letting the panel stay exactly as they left it, because sometimes the smartest move is letting a bad decision keep running until it reveals itself, and as I closed the gate behind me the latch clicked into place, solid this time, and I glanced once more at the lake, knowing the balance had already shifted, and it was only a matter of time before someone noticed the first sign. By noon the first complaint hit before I even left the driveway, a text from one of the residents asking why their sprinklers were pulsing instead of flowing, short bursts instead of a steady stream, and I could picture it without seeing it, water spitting in uneven rhythms across lawns that were used to perfect timing, and I did not answer, just set the phone down and listened to the quiet inside the truck. Because I knew that was only the beginning, and right on schedule the second message came through, then a third, same issue, same confusion, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the faint echo of pumps cycling harder than they should, that low mechanical strain creeping into the system like a warning nobody understood yet, and by early afternoon I drove back past the entrance to Willowbrook Ridge, not pulling in, just rolling slow enough to watch, and the change was subtle but there. Patches of grass already losing that deep green sheen, sprinkler heads misting unevenly, some barely reaching the edges they used to cover, and near the clubhouse the decorative fountain stuttered, water dropping in inconsistent arcs instead of that smooth curtain they were so proud of, and I caught sight of Brenda near the main walkway, phone pressed to her ear, pacing tight circles, her movements sharper now, less controlled, and even from a distance I could tell she was trying to fix something she did not fully understand. And a maintenance truck sat parked near the marina, a different one, not county, not one I recognized, and that told me she had already called someone else in, someone without the full picture, and that was exactly how systems break, too. Many hands, not enough understanding, and I kept driving, letting the scene unfold without me, because stepping in too early would only reset the problem without teaching the lesson, and the next morning the neighborhood felt different, quieter in a tense way, like people were waiting for something to return to normal, but it did not, and when I passed by again I saw more signs, hose lines stretched across yards where sprinklers failed, residents standing at the edges of their property lines, looking toward the lake like it owed them something, and the water level itself had dropped just enough to expose a darker ring along the shoreline, a detail most would miss but not me, not after years of watching that level hold steady through every season, and that drop meant the intake was pulling harder than it should, draining faster than the system could balance, and near the dock I saw the same officer from before talking to a small group, his posture different now, less certain, like this situation had shifted beyond a simple complaint, and Brenda stood beside him, her clipboard gone, replaced with a stack of papers she kept flipping through like the answer might appear if she looked hard enough, and then she spotted my truck as I slowed near the curb, and her eyes locked on mine for a second too long, recognition mixed with something else now, something closer to concern, and she started walking toward me, fast, determined, but I kept moving, not stopping, not engaging, letting her realize she no longer controlled how this played out, and in my rearview mirror I watched her stop mid-step, standing there as the fountain behind her sputtered again, weaker this time, and that was when it finally became clear to everyone watching that this was not just a broken sprinkler or a small maintenance issue, this was something tied to the entire system, something bigger than any single yard or rule, and as I turned onto the main road the hum of the pumps faded behind me, replaced by a silence that felt heavier than before, because now the imbalance was visible, and they could not ignore it anymore. And I knew the next move would not come from a complaint or a fine, it would come from panic, and panic always reveals who actually understands what they are dealing with. The call came just after sunrise, sharp and direct, Brenda's name flashing across my phone like she had finally decided to drop the act, and I let it ring twice before answering, listening to the faint background noise on her end, voices, movement, the hollow echo of the clubhouse lobby, and when I picked up she did not waste time, her tone tighter now, stripped of that polished HOA confidence. Asking if I had been near the pump system recently, not accusing this time, not commanding, just asking, and that shift told me more than anything else, because people like Brenda do not ask unless something has already slipped beyond their control, and I leaned against the truck, watching the early light stretch across the road, and told her I had been by the lake yesterday, nothing more, and there was a pause on the line, short but heavy, like she was deciding how much to admit. And then she said the irrigation system was failing across multiple properties, pressure drops, inconsistent flow, fountain offline, and I could hear the edge in her voice now, the kind that comes when a problem starts affecting more than appearances, when it starts hitting property value, and that is when she mentioned the contractors, 2 different crews already brought in since yesterday afternoon, both unable to stabilize the system, both saying the same thing. Something in the intake control was not cycling correctly, and I closed my eyes for a second, picturing that override switch still engaged, pulling more than it should, stressing the entire loop, and I asked her if anyone had accessed the marina control panel, and she hesitated again, longer this time, before saying one of her guys had checked it that morning, just to make sure everything was running, and that confirmed it. They were still touching it, still adjusting without understanding, making the imbalance worse with every attempt to fix it, and I pushed off the truck, standing upright now, feeling the weight of the situation settle into something more concrete. Because this was no longer a slow reveal, it was accelerating, and Brenda asked if I could come take a look, just a quick inspection, her words careful now, measured, nothing like the authority she carried on the dock, and I let the silence stretch for a second before answering, because timing matters, and I told her I was busy this morning, which was not entirely true, but it was necessary, and she exhaled sharply, frustration slipping through despite her effort to stay composed. And then she said something that shifted everything again. She said the board was considering shutting down lake access entirely until the issue was resolved, restricting all use, including maintenance, and that was her 4th mistake, trying to tighten control over something that was already slipping, and I could hear it in the background. Someone mentioning the water level, another voice talking about complaints coming in from the far side of the neighborhood, and Brenda's voice cut through them, sharper now, trying to regain order, but the structure she relied on was already starting to crack, and I told her I would think about it and ended the call before she could press further, and as the line went silent I looked out toward the direction of the lake, not seeing it from here but feeling the pull of it, the system still running, still drawing, still unbalanced. And every minute it stayed that way the problem would spread, not explode, not dramatic, just steady degradation, the kind that forces people to notice, to question, to look for answers, and I knew exactly when I would step back in, not before, not too late, right at the point where control shifts from assumed to proven, and I slid the phone into my pocket, listening to the quiet around me, knowing the next call would not sound like this one at all. By mid-afternoon the second call came, not from Brenda this time but from a number I recognized as the county utilities office, and that alone told me the situation had crossed a line, because they do not get involved unless something starts affecting shared infrastructure beyond private property, and when I answered the voice on the other end was calm but direct, asking if I had any recent service history with the Willowbrook intake system, and I told them I had worked on it last season. Nothing recent, and there was a pause before they mentioned irregular draw patterns showing up in the monitoring logs, higher than normal intake during off-cycle hours, enough to trigger a review, and I leaned against the truck again, feeling the weight of that detail settle in, because that meant the override had not just affected lawns, it had flagged upstream systems, and that was the fifth mistake, pushing a local control beyond its limits until it became visible at a level Brenda could not influence, and the utility agent asked if I knew who had accessed the panel recently, and I said I could not confirm without inspecting it myself, which was true in the most technical sense, and he told me they might send someone out if the pattern continued, and that would change everything, because once county oversight steps in, no HOA authority holds any weight, and when the call ended I stood there for a moment, listening to the distant sound of traffic and the faint wind moving through the trees, and I knew the timing had shifted. What started as a contained imbalance was now moving outward, connecting to systems beyond the neighborhood, and that meant the window to control how this played out was narrowing, and I got back in the truck and headed toward the lake again, not fast, not urgent, just steady, because rushing would only make it look reactive, and when I turned into Willowbrook Ridge the atmosphere had changed again, less confusion now, more tension, residents gathered in small groups near driveways, talking, pointing toward the lake, some holding hoses, others staring at sprinkler heads that barely moved, and the fountain at the clubhouse was completely still now, no water at all, just a dry basin reflecting the afternoon sun, and that sight alone told me the pressure drop had reached a critical point, because that fountain sits at the top of the distribution line, the first thing to lose flow when intake balance fails, and as I drove past the clubhouse I saw Brenda standing with two men in work shirts, one of them holding a tablet, both of them looking frustrated, their posture stiff, shoulders tight, and when she saw my truck she stepped forward immediately, no hesitation this time, no authority in her walk, just urgency, and I slowed to a stop, engine idling, window halfway down, and for a second neither of us spoke, the silence filled with the absence of water that used to define this place, and then she said they needed help, not in the controlled tone she used before, but in a way that acknowledged something had gone wrong beyond her ability to fix, and I let my eyes move past her toward the lake. Noticing the waterline again, lower now, the dark ring wider, and the intake point pulling harder than it should, and I could almost hear the strain in the system without stepping out of the truck, and I asked one simple question, who touched the control panel this morning, and the two contractors exchanged a quick glance before one of them admitted they had tried to reset the cycle, just a small adjustment, nothing major. And that confirmed the escalation, because each adjustment without understanding had compounded the imbalance, and I rested my arm on the window frame, considering the moment, because stepping in now would stabilize everything, bring the system back into balance, make the problem disappear, but it would also erase the lesson, and Brenda watched me closely, waiting for an answer, for direction, for control to return to something she could manage, and I could see it clearly now, the shift from authority to dependence, from command to request, and that is where real leverage exists, not in force, but in timing, and I finally opened the door and stepped out, boots hitting the pavement with a dull sound that seemed louder in the quiet, and all eyes turned toward me. Not as a rule breaker this time, but as the only person in that moment who actually understood what was happening, and I walked toward the marina path without rushing, knowing exactly what I was about to find waiting inside the control panel. I pushed the marina gate open and the metal latch snapped against the post with a clean echo that carried across the water, and behind me I could hear footsteps slowing, voices dropping, everyone watching without saying it out loud, because they all knew this moment mattered, and inside the control box the heat hit first, warmer now than it should have been, that faint electrical scent stronger, sharper, and I stepped closer, eyes scanning the panel, and there it was, the override still engaged. But now pushed further, someone had tried to force it back into balance without resetting the cycle, which only locked the system into a constant draw, and I could hear the pump struggling through the line, not loud, just enough to tell me it was under continuous load, and that kind of strain does not show immediately, it builds, minute by minute, pulling from the lake faster than the intake should allow, and I reached up and tapped the display, bringing up the live cycle data, and the numbers Confirmed it, sustained overdraw for hours, no recovery phase, no reset window, just continuous demand feeding a system that was already falling behind, and behind me one of the contractors stepped closer, trying to look like he understood what he was seeing, but his silence gave him away, and Brenda stayed just outside the gate, arms folded tight now, not in authority, but in tension, and I pointed at the toggle without looking back, asking who moved it. Again, and this time there was no hesitation. One of the men admitted they adjusted it twice, once in the morning, once after the pressure dropped further, thinking it would stabilize flow, and I nodded once, slow, because that was exactly the kind of fix that makes everything worse, and I explained it without turning around, simple, direct, telling them the system was never designed to run at constant intake, that the cycle depends on rest intervals to maintain pressure balance, and by forcing it they turned the entire loop into a drain, pulling faster than it could recover, and I finally flipped the override back to its original position, a small movement, barely a sound, but the effect was immediate. The hum shifted, lower, steadier, the kind of sound you feel more than hear when a system returns to its intended rhythm, and I waited a second, watching the display recalibrate, the numbers stabilizing, pressure rebuilding slowly instead of collapsing, and behind me someone exhaled, a quiet release of tension, but I did not move yet, because the system was not fixed, not fully, it would take time to recover, and they needed to understand that, and I stepped back from the panel, closing the box with a firm click, and turned to face them, the lake stretching out behind me, calm again on the surface but still carrying the effects underneath, and Brenda looked at me differently now, not as someone breaking her rules, but as someone she needed, and that shift hung in the air between us, heavier than any argument we had before, and she asked how long it would take to return to normal, and I told her it would not be immediate, that the system had been pushed too far, that pressure would come back in stages, lawns first, then the upper lines, the fountain last, and that answer landed harder than anything else I said, because it meant this was not something she could fix with a single order or a quick call, and one of the residents near the path asked if this could have been avoided, and I let that question sit for a second before answering, because the truth was simple, it always could have been, if the system had been respected instead of controlled, and I glanced back at the panel once more, knowing the numbers would stabilize now, but also knowing the real issue was not the hardware, it was the assumption of ownership without understanding, and that does not disappear with a switch, and as I stepped past Brenda toward the path she shifted slightly, like she wanted to say something more, something different this time, but she did not, and the silence between us said enough, because control had already moved, and it was not going back to where it was before. And as I walked away the hum behind me settled into a steady rhythm again, but the look on her face told me she had just realized what that rhythm actually depended on. The sprinklers came back in waves just before sunset, not all at once, but enough to shift the mood across the neighborhood, thin arcs of water stretching farther than they had that morning, catching the light in uneven lines, and I stood at the edge of the road watching it happen without stepping in, because recovery always tells you more than failure if you know what to look for, and the pressure was climbing, but not evenly, some yards still weak, others overshooting, which meant the system was compensating, trying to rebalance after being forced out of cycle for too long, and across the lake the fountain coughed once, a short burst that barely cleared the basin before dropping again, and that small movement drew a few people closer, like they were watching something come back to life, and Brenda was there too, standing near the walkway with her arms at her sides now, no clipboard, no papers, just watching, and when she noticed me across the street she did not wave, did not call out, just held that look a second longer than necessary, like she was trying to understand something she had missed before, and I turned away first, letting her sit with that, because the shift had already happened, and it was not about showing it, it was about letting it settle, and as I walked back toward my truck I could hear the pump hum again, steadier now, deeper, the kind of sound that means the system has found its rhythm again. But it was not the same as before, not exactly, there was a slight delay in the cycle, a small lag between intake and distribution that told me the balance would take time to fully restore, and that delay mattered, because it would keep the issue visible just long enough for people to connect the dots, and that is when I noticed the maintenance notice posted near the clubhouse entrance, bright white paper taped over the bulletin board, announcing temporary restrictions on water usage until further notice, and below it, a line that caught my attention, lake access suspended pending review. And I stopped walking, reading it again to make sure, because that was not just a reaction, that was a decision, one made quickly, probably in response to pressure, and it told me Brenda was trying to reassert control by limiting everything connected to the problem, including the source itself, and that move felt familiar, tightening rules when things slip, instead of understanding why they slipped in the first place. And I looked back toward the lake, still calm, still reflecting the houses that depended on it, and I thought about the way she had pointed at me on the dock, calling it private, claiming ownership without knowing the system behind it, and now she was trying to shut it down entirely to contain something she had already set in motion, and that contradiction sat there, clear and obvious, and it was enough to push me to take the next step, not with the panel, not with the pumps, but with something else entirely, something tied to the way this place defined ownership in the first place, and I climbed into the truck and pulled out my phone, scrolling past the missed calls, the messages, until I reached a number I had not used in a long time, one connected to records, not repairs, and I let my thumb hover there for a second, because this was the point where the situation shifted from fixing a system to redefining who actually controlled it, and once that line is crossed, it does not go back. And I pressed the call button, listening to it ring as the last light of the day settled over the lake, knowing this next move would not be about water flow at all. I heard the county clerk pick up on the third ring, her voice steady and familiar, and I stepped out of the truck so I could hear her clearly over the quiet street, explaining I needed to verify parcel records tied to the Willowbrook Lake Basin, not rushed, not urgent, just direct, and she asked for the lot reference, the old designation most people forget exists, and I gave it to her from memory, because I had worked around that system long enough to know where everything connected, and there was a pause as she pulled up the records, keys tapping softly in the background, and then she read it back. Slow, deliberate, the lake itself registered under a separate holding, not under the HOA, not under residential zoning, but under a private trust that had never been transferred into the association when the neighborhood expanded around it, and I closed my eyes for a second, letting that settle, because that was the piece I needed, the one thing Brenda had been standing on without ever checking. And the clerk asked if I needed a full copy of the documents, and I told her yes, including access rights, easement notes, and any historical use filings, and she said she would have it ready by morning, and when the call ended I stayed there a moment, listening to the distant hum of the system balancing itself behind the houses, because now the situation had shifted again, not just pressure and flow, but ownership, real control, the kind that does not come from signs or rules but from what is written and recorded. And the next day I drove back to Willowbrook Ridge just after sunrise, the air cooler, the light softer, and the first thing I noticed was the grass, still uneven in color, some patches recovering, others not, the system still stabilizing, and the fountain had returned, but only halfway, water rising in a thinner stream than before, enough to show improvement but not enough to hide what had happened, and Brenda was already outside, standing near the entrance with a folder in her hand, talking to two board members, her posture controlled again but not confident, more like someone holding something together instead of directing it, and when she saw me she walked over without hesitation, stopping just short of the truck, and this time there was no accusation, no authority. Just a direct question, asking if I had found anything, and I reached over to the passenger seat and picked up the envelope the clerk had prepared, thick, official, and I held it there for a second before handing it to her, watching the way her eyes moved as she opened it, scanning the pages, and I could see the moment it landed, the slight pause, the shift in her expression when she realized the lake was not actually under HOA ownership, that the control she had been claiming did not exist in the way she thought, and one of the board members leaned in, reading over her shoulder, his face tightening as the details became clear, and the silence around us stretched, heavier than anything before, because this was not a mechanical issue anymore, it was structural, legal, something that could not be fixed with a contractor or a quick decision, and Brenda looked up at me, not angry, not defensive, just processing, and she asked what that meant for access, for control, for the rules they had been enforcing, and I did not rush the answer, because this part matters, the moment where assumption meets reality, and I told her it meant the lake was not theirs to regulate the way they had been, not without the proper authority, not without going through the actual ownership structure that had been sitting there the entire time, untouched, and that answer landed in a way nothing else had, because it reached beyond sprinklers and fines, Beyond temporary fixes, into the foundation of how. She had been running things, and one of the residents nearby stepped closer, listening now, the situation pulling more attention than before, and I could feel the shift in the air, subtle but real, control moving away from policy and into something more concrete, and as Brenda closed the folder slowly, holding it tighter than before, I knew this was not the end of it, not even close. Because once ownership becomes part of the conversation, everything changes, and she looked back at the lake. Then at me, like she was about to say something else, something different this time.